Hi there, this is Steve Kimes, pastor of Unafraid Christian Community, and this is another MennoNerds interview. I'm sorry that Paul isn't here to do this today, but Paul is off, I don't know, doing probably on some vacation in Tahiti. I don't know. Anyway, I'm here to cover, and I'm here to talk to Benjamin Corey. Here today with his talking about his new volume. He is the author of the official blog of Benjamin Corey. He's also the author of Undiluted, and just recently he has a book published called Unafraid. Hello, Benjamin. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good, Steve. Thanks for having me on, fellow MennoNerds.
Yeah, no, and I actually, you and I are fellow authors because both of us have an article or a essay in the book The Living Alternative.
Oh, okay. So, absolutely awesome.
So we are partners of the digital variety.
Yes.
Brothers in the digital variety. All right, so I want to, I've got a lot of questions to ask you, and I'm gonna get down to some of them. Mm-hmm. So first thing I want to do is I want to actually bounce a question that was given to me and bounce it off of you, and I just want to see what it is that you hear. Now, the thing is that you are promoted, whether you like it or not, I don't know, but you're promoted as a progressive Christian.
Yeah.
And I have often presented myself that way. And then just recently, someone asked me, "Well, if you are calling yourself progressive, what do you mean by progressive?" And I've been thinking about that lately, so I thought I'd bounce that off of you. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And to be honest, I actually tackle this question in the book Unafraid. I talk a lot about how we use labels and the dangerous way that we use Christian labels, as if to kind of slap a label on somebody and to define them and understand them by this label. In the book, I talk about how there's almost like this idolatrous relationship we have with these labels because they shape meaning, they give identity. Often we can draw life from them. And so I think like any tool, words and labels can be used well or used poorly. So regarding the term progressive Christian, my first question is always like, well, what do you mean by that? Because it's not of course you could find definitions out there, but, being a progressive Christian isn't something where you sign on to a creed or you join a tribe that has, a written set of rules. I would suppose they actually do have a certain set of rules, and you ought to be careful about violating them as you would with any tribe. But in the end, like to me, I don't always know what they mean by progressive Christian because it's not as defined as, for example, you could define the term, evangelical. And so in that regard, for me, I am hesitant to draw any life from a label. And so if there are times where people see me as a progressive Christian, that's great. And that's fine with me if that's how they see me. When I read one of the very first reviews of Unafraid, one of their critiques was the person said, "Oh, he's still very much, very evangelical in many ways." And so for me, I don't draw a ton of life from them, but I do see the term progressive Christian being a really big umbrella that I'm not uncomfortable using precisely because it doesn't have to mean anything ultra specific other than you just don't really quite fit in some of these other categories. But of course, for me personally, if you want to talk about my Christian faith, the idea of progressive Christian doesn't drive me in any way, but certainly being an Anabaptist does. And so because that is more of a quantifiable, identifiable label that stands for certain things that I affirm. And so really, I'm a fellow MennoNerd.
And I think that's a great way of putting it. I mean, for me, my understanding of progressive, I mean, if similar to you, I was a fundamentalist and I was kind of my pre-Anabaptist stage. But the thing is that if I'm progressive, it's only because that's where my following of Jesus led me. It's not because I took on certain views. So all of a sudden I was conservative and now I'm ultra liberal or whatever it is that people want
Sure.
to think of as progressive. That's not the case.
Mhm.
I'm still the same person that I was, a follower of Jesus, and this
Yeah.
is just where it led me.
Yeah, no, exactly. And even like the term, even the entire, concept of progressive Christian, it's more about what you're not than what you are, because it's a reactionary term. It's I'm progressing beyond where they are. So it's almost like you're defining yourself in relation to how they define themselves. And so I don't find a ton of value in that. I'll use the term as much as it's helpful for other people to use it as a navigation term tool to kind of see where I might fall on certain issues. But certainly it's not one that I draw life from or I allow to shape my identity inside.
And it sounds like the term is so vague that perhaps it's actually difficult to get any life from it, because what exactly does it mean anyway? Which was the question I asked in the first place. It's actually hard to pin down.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
So, okay, well then the another question that I had is as a quote has been bouncing around my head for the last year or so, which is a quote from Thomas Merton, who said at one point, "If your theology is the same as it was 10 years ago, then you haven't developed in your faith."
Yeah.
And it seems to me, since your original blog, your blog right now is called The Official Blog of Benjamin Corey, but originally it was just called Formerly Fundie.
Mm-hmm.
And even with Unafraid, you're talking about progressions that you made in your faith. Is that something that seems true to you, that you've really moved on in your faith and that you are not the same person you were 10 or 20 years ago?
Oh gosh, I'm not the same person I was, year to year. And certainly there are some challenges to that, because there is a lot of emotional safety to be found in stability and consistency. And certainly there's one part of me that would love and feel safe to believe all the same things 10 years from now, because there's safety in when something doesn't change. But for me, it's not so much that it all changes by choice. It's just that I continue to get up each day and want to progressively learn to love the way that Jesus loved. And I want to follow him into whatever this new and exciting thing is that he's doing. And as I see, for me, the big thing that ends up changing and shaping my theology is really my heart as it expands in its capacity to love. It's a progress. It's really the entire theme of Unafraid. I talk about it at the end. I realized that this was really a journey about my heart expanding the capacity to love. And so I realized that as my ability to love and to see others the way God sees them slowly grows, and I slowly inch towards this progressive movement towards Jesus, that it can't help but make me rethink how I saw things before, because you're just always acquiring, new knowledge. And as far as just straight theology, yeah, I have a really curious and insatiable curiosity, and that naturally leads to following one rabbit trail after another, which ultimately shapes your theology. Some things don't change, some things will. There's certainly some certain core beliefs that I cannot fathom ever changing, no matter what. But there are other things that I am way open to being molded and shaped on them.
Every time that we make a shift in our belief or something, then we're also shifting relationships, and some people are saying, "Oh, I don't know that I can go there with you." Do you ever get nervous about where the next step is going to lead you, and whether and how your relationships are going to shift at that point?
Yeah, you know what? I don't anymore, because I've lost everything. In that, when I first started Formerly Fundie, I was a teaching elder at a church plant. Had really close friends. I had just moved back to my home state. had just really gone through a painful and difficult time in my adoption story. And, I won't get into that, but folks who have followed me, over the years know that I have had a deeply, deeply painful experience with adoption. And so I was a teaching elder pastor and at a church and had really great friends. And as I started Formerly Fundie, it was probably within a month that just everything began to implode in my life. And it was really centered around my shift to the topic of nonviolence. Strangely enough, adopting a theology of nonviolent enemy love was extremely costly to me. Cost me my church, cost me all of my friends, and literally woke up one morning and everybody in life had completely deserted me. And so, I've continued down the road of, writing and expressing myself publicly. And as my, my public presence has grown, the relationships in my private life have shrunk. So do I worry about where shifting theology is going to impact my relationships? Honestly, no, because I've lost everything. So
Wow.
I don't have anything to lose at this point.
I could see that. I have not been in that place. I probably hold certain of my relationships too much, but I can totally understand. I mean, once you've lost so much, and it's just like, oh well, it's just me and God. Wherever Jesus leads me, that's the way it is. So that's really, and that kind of really gets back to where it is that where your book is, your book title. I was looking at your book title. I was thinking, oh, okay, Unafraid. And I guess it's the evangelical that's still buried deep inside me that is saying that I saw the title. They say, oh, well, maybe this is a book about how we need to go forth boldly for God, or we need to, stand up for Jesus boldly and not be afraid of other people. But it turns out that what you're talking about is not being afraid of God, that so many of us grow up with or come into a relationship of fear with God. And you're talking about how damaging that fear is. Why is the fear of God so damaging?
Oh gosh. Well, it's because that, there is, the Bible itself says that, there's no fear in love. And so, in the book, I talk about it. When the Bible describes the opposite of love, it doesn't describe hate. When the Bible describes the opposite of love, it describes fear. And so the reason why beginning our faith with any degree of fear of God is precisely because it sabotages everything that we're told that life is supposed to be about right from the onset. Because you cannot have a healthy, authentic, and intimate relationship with someone you're afraid of. And I actually, in the book, I draw the parallel to ISIS fighters, and when they, the Jordanian pilot that they put into a cage and set on fire. And, I had written a blog post about it back then because, the entire world was outraged at just the barbarism that they would do this. And they're absolutely right. Like, the idea of lighting somebody on fire and tormenting them is just morally repulsive to anyone with a sense of humanity. And yet, as I watched that outrage, I just couldn't believe it, because I was thinking about, pretty much everybody I've ever known in Christianity growing up, and was like, guys, you do realize that you believe that that's exactly what God does, right? Like, this Jordanian pilot was a Muslim. Like, you guys think he was, unsaved and therefore going to hell. So how can we be outraged and find it morally repulsive, when ISIS does it, but somehow it's good and wonderful when God does it? And so I asked this question, could you truly fall in love with somebody who is an ISIS fighter, where you're secretly worried that in the back of your mind, they have this gas can hidden in the closet that under certain conditions, they're willing to take it out and light you on fire and torment you. And so I do not believe it is possible to have any sort of real relationship with somebody you're afraid of. You can have a seriously dysfunctional one where you are constantly trying to tiptoe around them. You're constantly trying to appease them. You're trying to avoid setting them off, but that's not a real relationship. And so why is the fear of God damaging? Is because it just ruins the ability to have the one thing we were told we were created for. We were told that we were created to have a relationship with God. And the only way you can do that is if you're unafraid.
Well, I think that actually most of us who have a relationship with God have a relationship that nowadays we would call dysfunctional.
Sure.
And
every relationship we have is dysfunctional to one degree or the other. Yeah.
Yes. Although the one with my daughter is perfect, of course, because she's sitting in front of me. And so my relationship with her is perfect. But apart from that, every relationship has its ups and downs. And I guess people would say, well, okay, this is the God, and we need, this is God. He created us. He is our Father. He is our protector. And so, yes, perhaps he does have this threat, but that's the reason why Jesus died, and this is the reason why we're in a new place with God. But because we're in this new place, we don't have to be afraid. Maybe we did have to be afraid before, but we don't now. So, isn't that great? Isn't that where we're supposed to be?
Yeah, but it's like, man, how do you know for sure that he's not still pissed off? It's like, the way we see like the atonement, it actually, the only place in the Bible where it describes the essence of God is when it says that God is love. And certainly it will, I think, Greg Boyd has talked about this, where it will, there will be times where it says that, God is just, but it doesn't say he is justice itself. So the only time that we see the essence of God described is when it says that God is love. And so, but, in this paradigm of atonement where, okay, we don't have to be afraid because Jesus, took the beating for us. What that does, though, is instead of making the central essence of God love and like the one thing that constrains all of God's qualities, in that paradigm, God is actually a slave to his anger. As in God cannot do anything about it. To say that, no way for God to forgive us, no way for God to draw close to us, no way, not without Jesus, taking the beating. And so when we understand the atonement that way, God's central essence is not love. God is actually a slave to his own anger. And so it's incredibly damaging to view it that way, because how can you ever be sure? I mean, I affirm that Jesus died for our sins in whatever way that actually took place. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to completely understand it. There are so many different motifs to look at. But this idea that, God can only love us when he has that pound of flesh is just so damaging. And that's why I try to remind people that, the only time also in the Bible where we see like the perfect essence of God revealed is in Jesus. Jesus said that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so, like my friend Greg will say, so if you want to ask, describe what God is like, the only way to do that is describe what Jesus is like. And Jesus is the last person I can ever imagine like tormenting me.
Okay, well, I mean, we're talking about Greg Boyd, and Greg Boyd spent a long time talking about the Old Testament. You've got a chapter in your book on that. In that chapter, you called the God that is described in the Old Testament as the puppy destroying God, as the God who sent. God, the puppy slayer. Yes. So you have, you've got God who said, okay, you go out there and destroy not only all the people, not only all the women and children, but also destroy all the animals and the puppies. Kill the puppies.
Yeah.
And that is horrendous, and that has scarred me for life. I just want to let you know that. Right.
Well, I didn't mean to describe it that way. I mean, I was retelling a story of reading like the Bible to my daughter and got to that story. And yeah, she turned to me and she's like, but Dad, why would God tell him to kill everybody, even like the children and puppies? Like she was just just aghast at the idea. Like, well, wait a minute. And so yeah, that became I was at a crossroads in that moment, because I was like, oh man, I may not have my theology of how the Old Testament works out the way sorted out the way Greg does, where he can write 2 massive volumes. But I was put on the spot, and I had to come up with something for my kid.
And you didn't have time to pull out, the warrior god and find the right right paragraphs and read them to her, I'm sure.
No.
But I still have a couple questions about this. I mean, it also says in Proverbs that wisdom begins with the fear of God. Even in Romans chapter 1, it talks about, it begins everything with talking about God's wrath is on all people. And so doesn't the Bible as a whole kind of teach us, say, well, begin with the fear of God, and then we're going to move you away from that?
Yeah, certainly there is. And that's what makes, the tension of this journey, that there is so much tension in Scripture. One of the things I say in the book is anytime that there is tension between, what Jesus said or modeled and what we see said or modeled in other parts of Scripture, the tiebreaker always goes to Jesus. And so certainly throughout the Old Testament, they describe God as an angry God. And yes, in Proverbs it says the fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom, and on that one, I think it's largely a difficult issue with language and translation. Of course, anybody who has been to seminary and had to learn biblical languages, as I did over the course of my 8 years, knows that there are plenty of words that do not have a one-for-one equivalent in English that have the exact same nuance as it did in the original language and the way that was actually used in the original culture where it was. And so as far as the fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom, if you really want to get into the nuance of it, it's not talking about fear as in terror. It's talking about a healthy level of respect. And so to say like having like a real reverence and a healthy respect for God is the beginning of all wisdom, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But certainly other parts of the Bible, does it describe an angry God? Yeah, I mean, throughout the Old Testament, that is certainly how they described him. But just because, or like Pete Enns says, we have to also remember that this is a situation where God let his kids tell the story. And so I do not believe that every way they describe God is absolutely accurate. I think Greg Boyd calls these shadows, that sometimes it's an example by negation. And so ultimately, I don't have all the tension worked out. What I do believe is that Jesus is the exact representation of God. And so I whether or not like the Old Testament has all these things, it does. But I don't start with the Old Testament. I have to start with Jesus. And so Jesus becomes, the thing that I measure and compare all other things to. And so I have to start with Jesus.
And I think that's really good. You do the quote that's been often said that the Bible is not the Word of God. Jesus is the Word of God. You have that in your book, which is actually C.S. Lewis said that himself, and I believe that comes straight from the New Testament. Where they're saying, okay, yes, we have the prophets and we have the law, we have the Old Testament. But the fact is that let's look to Jesus. And Jesus himself said, you can't actually understand or interpret the Old Testament unless you have the Christ. The Christ is the teacher. He's your only teacher. And so that makes sense. Now, I think that some people might come and say, well, but aren't you heading into the Marcionite heresy, where you're making a
Sure.
huge divide between
Oh,
the
yeah.
Old Testament and the New Testament.
Mhm.
Do you have anything to say to that?
Oh my
Because I
gosh,
would
this
like to
is
hear
like
it, because I think that in my head, you know.
oh, absolutely. No. This is a question that actually comes up often. I mean, man, the amount of times that I have been branded a heretic and a Marcionite, especially by the Calvinists, like it's endless. And honestly, all of us will face that. Anybody who is like a really, really Jesus-centered, ultimately will get accused of that if you dare critique anything in the Old Testament. Now, a lot of people just don't understand what that original heresy was. He thought they were two different gods. He wanted to set aside like the entire Old Testament, saying the whole thing is junk. And I do not know a single one of us. I think of some of the other prominent teachers out there that really critique the Old Testament. I said, myself, there's Greg Boyd, there's Brian Zahn. Like, none of us are saying set aside the Old Testament. None of us are saying like you do away with it, it's junk. They're different gods. None of us are saying that. None of us are guilty of that heresy. We are simply arguing that what you have to do is reinterpret your understanding through the lens of Old Testament scripture through the lens of Jesus. It is very different than that heresy. It's not true. Excuse me.
So what some people also might think is, so we're talking about that you're saying, let's not have fear of God, that we can't have a good relationship with God if that relationship is based on fear, that doesn't work. And yet, even Jesus talks about Gehenna. He talks about punishment.
Yeah.
You've got the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And even if you say, well, maybe poor people are okay, but man, rich people have something to really be scared of.
Yeah.
So if we're going to have Jesus as our source, doesn't he also talk about the fear and how we have something to kind of be afraid of?
Yeah, no, for sure. And absolutely, there is not all fear is bad. Like terror is bad. Like a relationship rooted in fear is bad. However, that is not to mean that relationships don't have boundaries. That is not to mean that anything goes. Like, when I say we're not supposed to be afraid of God, I'm not becoming like a Unitarian Universalist. I am just saying that you can't begin a relationship based on that. But however, absolutely, the New Testament is centered around like this coming judgment and not wanting to be on the wrong side of God. But the way that I have described that before, I don't know if I tease it out in the book, but certainly I have on my blog, is this. So here's what I believe. I believe that God is moving the entire human story in this beautiful direction of restoration. I believe that when things started out, that God had an ideal that he was shooting for. However, like Thomas Ord would say, that God is essence is love, and so he's not going to coerce you to do things that you don't want to do. Therefore, something in the story went way, way wrong. As soon as that moment of time happened where things in God's story went wrong, God immediately began a plan to reverse all of it and to right all of these wrongs. And ever since then, the entire human story has been moving in the direction to make the final chapter look just like the first chapter. We see Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 beginning God, dwelling with humanity in a garden. There was all this wonderful stuff. And you know what? We see, Revelation, 21, 22, the last few chapters of the Bible, and the same way the first two happened. There's this beautiful bookend. And so, yeah, I believe that God is moving the human story in a beautiful direction. I believe that along that way, in order to bring it to wholeness, it involves actually addressing things that continue to make the world more broken. And that's why, fellow, Anabaptists are really engaged in, nonviolent peacemaking, but can be very confrontational, as far as justice work. We're trying to contribute to moving God's story in that direction of wholeness. And oftentimes that involves addressing things that continue to make the story broken. And so as far as is there room to be, afraid of God or fear of God? It's not God's character and essence that we need to be afraid of, because God is love. However, for those who are not on board with God's plan to bring wholeness and restoration to everything, and for those who want to fight and to kick against God's love and to stand in the way with it and to try to resist it or to deliberately sabotage it and to go a different way, for those people, they're going to be on the wrong side of God's love. And I can only imagine that whatever feeling they experience must feel like wrath. And it must feel like he might be someone you need to be afraid of, but it's not that at all. It's that you're trying to push and kick against what God is doing. You're resisting love. You're pushing against love. And God is determined to win in the end. And so you're deliberately choosing to be on the wrong side of that friction.
It's interesting because when my son was really, really small, he would have these amazing, horrible tantrums. And I think it was you that mentioned something like this, but he would have these horrible tantrums. And when he would have them, then I would basically just hold on to him, make sure that he's not going to hurt himself or hurt anybody else. And when he's doing that, to him, his perspective is, I am torturing him. I am doing horrible things to him when actually I'm trying my best to love him. And I wonder if a lot of times that's how it is with God, that God is basically just, you're having a tantrum. Would you please stop and hang on? Let's just get through this, and everything will be okay. And, just God being that father who is loving us, but to us, it feels like torture.
I really connect with that metaphor. It's a really good metaphor. I mean, having raised kids with special needs, some who have had very violent homicidal tendencies years ago. I have been in that position of having to do what we would call a nonviolent restraint, where you are trying to stop somebody from harming themselves or harming others, but you're trying to do it in a way that doesn't harm them. But to them, not a pleasant experience, even though you're not the one inflicting any harm on them. And absolutely, I think that is actually a really brilliant metaphor for what it must be like to fight against God's love and for why it feels like wrath in that moment.
So it seems to me in studying Jesus that what he says is God is love and God is grace, and God's grace looks like forgiveness, and God's grace looks like compassion, and looks like generosity and all of these things. However, if we don't live according to that grace and compassion and generosity and forgiveness, then we don't actually understand God's love. And in a sense, we're outside of that, not outside the scope of God's love, but we're not dwelling in it. And so how would you talk to somebody who is oppressing, whether they are doing it knowledgeably or not, somebody who is harming other people, maybe even in the name of God? How would you talk to that person and say, that this isn't the direction that, I don't want to say that you should be afraid of God, but there's something that you need to deal with God.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question because I don't know if there is a blanket. I don't know how you can, give kind of a blanket response, because I believe that every two people in the world are different. We all have ways of being communicated with that connect with us, certain things that work well with us, certain things that don't. And I think what works with one person might not work with another. And so I think really it is certainly a case-by-case basis where you really have to seek God and really invite the Holy Spirit to help show you how to address those issues of injustice, how to how to interact with people in a way where you might persuade them. And yeah, sometimes we have to confront, sometimes we have to do this, and sometimes we have to do that. But certainly I would really seek the Spirit in every single situation, because I just don't know how there is one blanket way to do that when everybody is so different.
Well, that's what we get for being on a mass media section. We're always trying to put things in a box. And what I hear you saying is, I'm sorry, there's no box for this one. You're just on your own.
No, it's not so much that you're on your own. There's, man, I honestly don't know how, what kind of script would work. Certainly with some people, I'm more forceful and confrontational. I am learning as I go that, lots of people don't respond well when you're kind of a jerk about it. And so I do try to be more loving in my approach. But of course, love can be forceful. Love can be blunt. Love can be bold. But again, I honestly every person is different. It's hard to say.
So let me just ask you, one more question. We're probably going to need to wrap up here.
Okay.
So why is it, if our relationship with God is supposed to be one of love, in which we receive his love and we give love to him, why is it that we so desperately hold on to our fear? Why is it that we're going to continue on, and in fact, actually continue to keep going to churches in which we hear fear speech every week, and every time that we are relating to God, we have to make sure that we are going to find sins that we can confess to him. Otherwise, we're not going to feel like we're actually in a good relationship with him. Why is it that we hold on to that fear when that's not actually what God is looking for?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And that, I know that, some of it is certainly habitual, in that this is like so deeply ingrained into the Christian narrative that I think most people don't even question letting go of it, or even, really give it much thought, because it is just so commonplace. It's part of our foundation. So it's just, it's one of those things that you see every day and you don't really pay much attention to it, because it's just always there. And so I also think, certainly there are times where sometimes we draw life from things that you would be surprised somebody could draw life from. There's oftentimes when we keep doing something, even though we claim that we don't like it, if we keep doing it, it's because 51% of us wants to keep doing it. 51% of us is actually getting something out of it. As soon as that flips around, 51% of us isn't getting something out of it anymore, we start wanting to change. And so, I think largely we just keep doing it because it has been like so ingrained that we almost don't know what we would do without it. And even in some cases, quite honestly, sitting in fear is the easy way out. In the book, I have a chapter on, this fear-based view of eschatology and like the future of God's story. And I draw actually a parallel. I was sitting in the movies one day watching this Disney movie, Tomorrowland, with my daughter. And I was just blown away with the parallel between that and, eschatology, in that, in this movie, like the world was scheduled to end, and like this big clock was ticking down because they had built this machine that could predict the future. And it was predicting that the world was going to end, and everybody thought there was nothing that you could do to change it. And so the story was moving in a really bad direction. And so this one main character, she was the first one to question it. And she was just like, what if we just break the machine? What if the world is ending because this machine is telling everybody it's ending and there's no hope to avoid it? And so, the villain in the story, he says, yes, you're right. He's like, and you want to know why? He's like, because to believe that to just believe this fear-based thing that the world is ending requires nothing of people today. They can just sit back and do nothing. And so I think oftentimes, we live with that fear because fear allows us to be frozen and to do nothing.
I think that's really true. I think that if we have a habit of fear, then that's what we're used to. That is what we're going to live with. And it's easy to continue the habit. I think the hardest thing is to do what Thomas Merton said that we talked about, and that is change our theology every 10 years. To say, well, what I believed before isn't where Jesus is leading me. That what I believed before doesn't seem to be where Jesus ever was. So I need to move on from there. I think that's the hardest thing. The hardest thing for us to do.
It sure is. It sure is.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for you folks out there. Man, I really recommend getting Unafraid. It's a great book. It is a very Anabaptist book. If you're an Anabaptist, man, go get this book because it's a great summary of a lot of ideas that are out there. And I really recommend it. I didn't get to all my questions, but I knew that would happen. Thank you again, Benjamin, for talking with me. Really, it was a really good discussion. And just want to say that both my wife and I really appreciate your blog. We've been reading it for years.
Oh, okay.
And so thank you for that and for your continuing work.
Sure. No, it was absolute pleasure. I feel like coming on this podcast after, all the interviews and stuff I've done around the book kind of feels like coming home back to my roots and back to my core family, my fellow MennoNerds and Mennonites. So thanks for having me on.
MennoNerd folks, have a good week, and may the Lord bless you and keep you and give you peace.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at MennoNerds.com. It's the hub for all things MennoNerds. From there, you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now, there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out MennoNerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.
Did you hear the phone go? I made sure that my phone was off, and
That's
then
funny.
My wife's phone goes right next to it.
Oh, okay.
So
I was thinking like maybe it was like kids just playing with toys, and I was like, that's totally cool. Oh, that's funny. So.
Oh, it's funny. My daughters are just cracking up over here. They're just like, oh yeah, we were so careful, so very careful.